Story number 1. The Snow-Covered Forest and the Ghost. I don't know why I ever agreed to go on that trip. At the time, it seemed like the kind of adventure that would bond us. A group of old college friends getting together for a few days of winter fun in the mountains. It had been years since we'd all been in the same place at once. Everyone scattered across the country with their jobs, families, and lives. But when Jack called and suggested we rent a cabin up in the Adirondacks for a weekend of skiing and drinking, I figured, why not? It had been a while since I'd gotten away from the grind, and the idea of fresh powder and snow-covered trees was a temptation I couldn't ignore. So, on the morning of our first day in the mountains, we loaded up our gear and made our way into the forest. There were 5 of us, me, Jack, Sarah, Doug, and Lisa. We'd been friends since college. The kind of friendships built on shared experiences that linger long after the years pass. Doug and Lisa were married, the kind of couple that could finish each other's sentences, while Jack and Sarah had been the single ones, always jumping from one fling to the next. But we all shared something that kept us coming back to each other, even when life was pulling us in different directions. The first day was perfect. The snow was light and fluffy, the kind you dream about when you think of a winter wonderland. We spent the day on the slopes, skiing through the trees and laughing like we hadn't a care in the world. But as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, we decided to take a break and rest for a while. We stopped in a clearing deep within the forest, where the trees grew so thick that the sunlight barely touched the snow-covered ground. We pulled out some thermoses of hot coffee and gathered in a circle, sitting on the cold earth with our backs against the trunks of trees. The air was sharp, biting at our cheeks, but the warmth from the coffee helped ease the chill. It was then that Jack brought up the story. "You guys remember Adam, right?" he asked, his voice low as he stirred his coffee. "The guy who used to hang around with us in college." I nodded, although the name didn't ring a bell at first. Adam? I tried to picture the face, but nothing came to mind. "He was the guy who got lost in these woods," Jack continued. "Remember? Right around this time of year, maybe 15 years ago." Suddenly, the name clicked. Adam. I could barely remember him, but I did recall the rumors that swirled around his disappearance. How he'd gone out for a solo hike one afternoon and never returned. They'd found his tracks leading into the forest. But after that, nothing. No body, no clues, just silence. The search had gone on for weeks before they called it off, and his name had faded into the kind of tragedy people mention only in hushed tones. "That's the place," Jack said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "They say something's off about these woods, that the forest takes people." I laughed, but it was the kind of nervous laugh that didn't quite reach my eyes. Doug and Lisa exchanged uneasy glances, and Sarah, ever the skeptic, shook her head. "Come on, Jack," she said, rolling her eyes. "That's just nonsense. People get lost. It happens." But even as Sarah spoke, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. The wind had picked up, and the trees around us creaked and groaned under its force. The light had begun to fade, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow, and in that moment, I felt something I couldn't explain, a prickling sensation, as though we weren't as alone as we thought. "Do you hear that?" Lisa's voice cut through the growing tension. We all turned to look at her, but she was staring into the distance, her face pale. "Hear what?" I asked. "Someone's calling," she said, her voice trembling. "I swear I heard my name." I stood up, the blood draining from my face. My heart began to beat faster, and I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the trees. But there was no one. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so, save for the whispering wind. "Lisa, are you okay?" Doug asked, his voice laced with concern. "I'm fine," she said, but there was a tremor in her voice that made my stomach twist. I thought I heard it." We all fell silent, straining to listen. For a moment, there was nothing, just the wind, the creaking trees, the occasional crunch of snow beneath our boots. But then, Laura! The voice came again. It was a whisper, distant but unmistakable. It sent a chill through my bones. I didn't know who it was, but I knew without a doubt that it wasn't one of us. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice thin. We all nodded in unison, the same fear creeping into our veins. "It's probably just the wind," Jack said, though his voice faltered. "No," Doug said sharply, his eyes wide. "That was someone calling our names. It came from over there." He pointed towards the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was a dark, impenetrable mass, the shadows deepening as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. I didn't want to go anywhere near that place, but something compelled me, something primal in my gut that told me we had to check. The snow was thick underfoot, muffling our steps as we walked toward the treeline. But as we got closer, the air seemed to grow colder, and the snow beneath our boots seemed to shift, as if something or someone was just beyond our sight. "Laura!" The voice came again, louder this time, and it sent a tremor through my spine. It was so clear, so unmistakable, that I could almost feel the breath on my neck. But when I turned around, no one was there. Suddenly, we heard a scream, a distant, terrible scream that echoed through the trees. It was Sarah. She ran toward the sound, but by the time we reached her, she was already standing still, staring into the distance. "I don't see her," Sarah whispered. "Where did she go?" We looked around, but Lisa was gone. Just gone. There were no footprints in the snow leading away from where she'd been standing. Nothing that suggested she'd moved at all. But when I looked down, I saw something in the snow, her footprints, leading off into the woods, growing fainter with every step. "I'll go after her," Jack said, his face pale. But as soon as he took a step forward, I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't go in there. It's too dark." But it was already too late. Jack had already stepped into the woods, following the faint trail of footprints. We stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do. The wind howled around us, and the trees whispered like they were alive. And in the distance, I thought I saw a figure, a shadow, just at the edge of my vision. Someone or something was watching us. We waited, and we listened, but Jack never came back. By the time we made our way back to the cabin, the snow had started falling harder, as though the forest itself were trying to bury us in silence. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. Lisa was gone. Jack was gone. And the forest had claimed them. We never spoke of that night again. Story number 2. It was late December, just a few days shy of Christmas, and the world outside the train window was a study in black and white. Snow drifted lazily from a starless sky, piling into soft white mounds on the platforms and tracks, while the trees and distant hills formed charcoal silhouettes against the darkness. I remember feeling uneasy that evening, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Perhaps it was the silence that settled thick around me whenever I stopped reading my paperback, or the way my own reflection in the glass seemed a stranger. Maybe it was just the loneliness of traveling alone during the holidays. But in retrospect, I think I sensed the wrongness before I even knew what it was. I was heading from Boston to a small town in upstate New York to spend the holidays with an old college friend. The train was far from crowded that night. A handful of sleepy passengers sat scattered through the cars, most of them nodding off as the rhythmic clickety-clack lulled their worries away. I'd risen from my seat to stretch my legs and wander to the vestibule between cars. The heating system struggled against the chill that seeped through the metal walls, and I shivered slightly, rubbing my hands together. The air smelled faintly of wet wool and the chemical tang of industrial cleaners. We rolled into a tiny station somewhere just past midnight. The place barely deserved the name, a solitary platform, a dim overhead light buzzing with insects that had frozen to death weeks ago, and a wooden bench half buried in snow. I pressed my face closer to the window on the vestibule door, curious as always about the nameless towns that the train passed through in the dead of night. That's when I saw her. A woman stood alone on the platform. She wore a long gray coat that hung limply from her shoulders, and a dark hat whose brim obscured much of her face. Despite the cold, her posture was relaxed, almost serene. I felt a small spike of pity or concern. What was she doing out here, waiting at a station so isolated? The train slowed with a squeal, and as it did, a sudden gust of wind scattered the snowflakes and made the overhead lamp flicker. For a moment, she seemed to waver in and out of sight. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks. When the train sighed to a halt, I watched as the door of the car ahead of mine opened, and a handful of passengers stepped out onto the platform. I hadn't noticed them before, and I wondered briefly if they'd been sleeping. There were perhaps half a dozen of them, and they hovered around the woman, though not one approached her directly. Instead, they sort of drifted, as if unsure what to do next. I waited to see if the woman would board. Curiosity gnawed at me. The conductor gave a muffled announcement, something about weather delays, and I caught sight of a tall man in a heavy coat assisting the woman up the steps. She moved with a languid grace, her coat trailing after her. Then they vanished inside. A few moments later, the train lurched into motion again. I stepped back from the door and decided to head forward, maybe to get a cup of coffee from the cafe car. Passing through the cars, I noticed something strange. Despite having clearly seen a small group board, the train didn't seem any fuller. I frowned. Perhaps they'd all gone straight to their compartments? But these were not sleeping cars, just regular old coach seats and one cafe section. Besides, I hadn't seen compartments in use here. Unease coiled in my stomach as I reached the cafe car and found it empty except for the board attendant leaning on the counter. I asked him, "Did we pick up new passengers at that last stop?" He looked at me like I'd asked if the sky was green. "No stop scheduled until Albany," he said. His voice sounded hollow, distant. He gave a half shrug. "Probably just your imagination." I knew we'd stopped. I felt it. I'd seen it. But the attendant wouldn't budge. I ordered a coffee and took it back to my seat, trying to reassure myself that I was just tired. But as I returned to my car, I froze in the aisle, seated a few rows ahead on the opposite side, partially hidden by a headrest, was the woman in the gray coat. I was sure of it. Her posture was the same, back straight, shoulders set. The brim of her hat cast a shadow over her face, and I couldn't see her eyes. My heart fluttered. She had boarded the train. I wasn't crazy. I slid into my seat and tried to appear nonchalant. But my nerves were jangling. I decided that, after I finished my coffee, I'd approach her, ask if she needed help or if she'd noticed anything strange. I stared out the window, mustering my courage. The train rumbled on, wheels singing on icy rails. The conductor's muffled announcements came and went, mentioning no delays, no unscheduled stops, no passengers boarding in the middle of nowhere. Finally, I stood, with quiet steps. I made my way to where I'd seen her. She was gone. I looked up and down the aisle, peering over seatbacks, but there was no sign of the gray-coated woman. An older couple at the far end of the car frowned at me as I hovered near their seats, and I mumbled an apology. Where the hell had she gone? She couldn't have moved so quickly and silently without my noticing. My skin prickled. I began checking the next car forward, even the bathrooms, but found no one. Feeling foolish, I returned to my seat. For a long time, I sat there, heart thudding, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. I still smelled a hint of her perfume, something faintly floral, drifting in the stale train air. The next scheduled stop was a larger station, Burlington Crossing. We were supposed to arrive in about an hour. I resolved to watch closely this time. If that group of passengers I'd seen really boarded, maybe they'd depart there. Maybe I'd find some proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Time dragged. I tried reading, tried closing my eyes, but my thoughts kept circling back to that silent platform in the snow. The train's rocking eventually lulled me into a kind of trance, and I realized with a start that we were pulling into Burlington Crossing. Snow fell harder now, swirling under the yellowish lights of the platform. I pressed my forehead to the window, scanning eagerly for familiar faces. The train shuddered to a stop. A few weary travelers stepped off, their boots crunching on the snow-covered platform. A tall man in a parka, a young woman dragging a suitcase, a mother holding a sleepy child's hand. But no one resembling the group I had seen, and no sign of the woman. I peered into the next car. The seats were sparse, maybe half a dozen passengers total. None were dressed as I remembered. No clusters of new arrivals. Just a handful of strangers who looked as though they'd been there the whole journey. The train started moving again, and my unease sharpened into fear. If they hadn't gotten off, then where were they? Vanished into thin air? It was absurd. I decided to speak to the conductor directly. I found him near the cafe car, punching tickets with mechanical precision. "We picked up passengers at that little station before, didn't we?" I asked, trying to sound calm. He gave me a blank look. "We made no unscheduled stops tonight, sir," he said. "We're running straight through." "I saw them," I insisted. "A woman in gray, a few others. They got on when we stopped." He cut me off with a slight frown. "If you're feeling unwell, sir, I suggest you return to your seat. We'll be at Albany soon." He was lying. Or worse, he truly believed we hadn't stopped. Was this some kind of mass gaslighting? A trick of the light? My head swam as I returned to my seat. The windows had frosted over now, and I couldn't see much outside. The train felt different, colder, quieter. Even the hum of the HVAC seemed muted. I slumped in my seat, staring at the reflection of the car's dim lights in the window. That's when I realized something else. The reflection of the seats behind me wasn't matching what I knew should be there. Instead of the older couple, I saw several silhouettes standing, still as statues. One of them wore a hat with a broad brim. My pulse hammered as I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just empty seats and worn upholstery. I looked back to the window, and again, I saw their shapes in the reflection, a half-dozen figures clustered together. And in their midst, the woman with the gray coat. This time, I could see a hint of her face. Pale, stern, and strangely sorrowful. Her lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. I tore my gaze away, heart pounding. When I looked back, the reflection was gone. The train rattled through the darkness. I tried to steady my breathing, to focus on something rational. Maybe I dozed off. Maybe this was a dream. But I knew I was awake. I could feel the chill of the air and the dull ache in my legs. At the next stop, another small station, I pressed my face to the glass again, expecting the impossible. And I saw them, the group that had boarded earlier. The same indistinct passengers, stepping off onto the platform with eerie grace. The woman stood at the center, her hat tilted downward. One by one, they vanished into the swirling snow as if dissolving into the night. By the time I mustered the courage to run down the aisle and look from the vestibule door, there was no one there, just fresh snow and the distant cry of wind. By the time I returned to my seat, I knew I had witnessed something beyond explanation. A haunting, maybe, the ghosts of passengers boarding and disembarking from stations that didn't exist on the timetable. The woman in gray, leading them on and off the train like a silent usher between worlds. The rest of the journey passed in a haze. I dared not speak to anyone else. When we finally reached my destination, the platform bright under harsh fluorescent lights, I stepped onto solid ground with shaky legs. I half expected to see the woman among the passengers on the platform, but she was nowhere to be found. Only ordinary people, hurrying through the cold, oblivious to the mysteries of the night. I never spoke of that experience to my friend. What could I say? That I'd seen ghosts boarding the train? That I'd watched them vanish at stations not on any schedule? He would have laughed or looked at me with pity. But that night changed something in me. Ever since, whenever I travel by train at night, I can't help pressing my face to the window, searching for that solitary figure in gray. I know she's out there, waiting at some forgotten platform, ready to board a train that exists halfway between this world and the next. And I know, if I'm not careful, I might find myself riding along with her and her silent companions, riding until I vanish. 2. Into the winter darkness. Story number 3. The threat from the ghost in the snow. It was Christmas Eve, and the world was wrapped in a blanket of snow. The kind of snow that makes everything look so pristine, so peaceful, that you almost forget how dangerous the winter nights can be. The streets were quiet, the usual bustle of the holiday season muted by the heavy snowfall. There were no cars on the road, no people out and about, just the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots as I made my way through the park. The air was sharp, colder than usual for this time of year, but I didn't mind. There was something about being alone in the stillness, surrounded by the quiet of the falling snow, that made me feel at peace. My name is Laura, and I had always enjoyed these solitary walks, even if people thought I was a little strange for walking in the snow alone at night. I had been walking for about half an hour, my breath coming out in visible puffs as I made my way through the park. The trees around me were bare, their branches heavy with snow, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of white. I knew this park well, had walked through it countless times, but tonight, something felt different. It was the silence, or maybe the absence of sounds. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic, just the faint whisper of wind and the crunch of my boots against the snow. I paused for a moment, taking it all in. When I heard it, a soft sound, like the crunch of snow, coming from behind me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the wind, perhaps, or the settling of snow on the ground. But then the sound came again, louder this time. I turned quickly, my heart suddenly racing in my chest. There was no one there, just the empty path, the snow, the trees. The park was as empty as it had been a moment ago. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath catching in my throat, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was nothing, I told myself. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was the cold playing tricks on my mind. But as I turned to continue walking, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Fresh footprints appeared in the snow behind me. Footprints that weren't there a moment ago. Large, deliberate steps, perfectly matching the pattern of my own. But they were following me. I stopped in my tracks. My mind raced. How could this be? No one had passed me. No one had come close enough to leave tracks in the snow. I was certain of it. And then, I heard the voice. It was faint at first, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. A voice from behind me, soft and chilling. Don't turn around. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, my skin crawling. The voice was almost familiar, like something I had heard in a dream, or a memory long buried. It was a voice that chilled me to my core, and yet, it was impossible to ignore. I had to get out of there. I had to move. With a deep breath, I forced my legs to move, picking up my pace. But the footprints behind me grew faster, closer, as if they were gaining on me. The snow crunched underfoot, louder now, almost synchronized with my own steps. I felt the cold air biting at my skin, the weight of something dark and heavy pressing in on me from behind. Couldn't look back. I couldn't afford to. The voice came again, more insistent this time. Don't look back. Laura. I didn't know how it knew my name. I didn't care. I just needed to get to safety, to the warmth of my home. I pushed forward, my breath coming faster, more shallow. The snow, the silence, the cold, they all felt like a trap closing in on me. As I neared the edge of the park, where the streetlights flickered in the distance, I could hear the footsteps behind me, still following. Each step was slow, deliberate, but it was always just out of sight. I was so close to the street now, so close to safety, and yet I could feel the presence behind me, like a shadow pressing in. I made it to the sidewalk, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. I was almost there, almost home. I glanced over my shoulder, just for a split second, just to confirm I was alone. There was no one there. The footsteps had stopped. The voice had gone silent. I stood there for a moment, my eyes scanning the street, the park. The snow had started to fall more heavily now, and everything looked like it had before. Silent, empty, but my heart still raced in my chest, and the fear gnawed at me. When I turned to continue my walk home, I heard something that froze me in my tracks. The voice again, now faint but clear. "I'm still here, Laura." I didn't turn around. Couldn't. I just kept walking, faster now, my breath short and panicked, the snow crunching loudly beneath my boots. When I finally reached my front door, I didn't hesitate. I didn't check behind me. I just rushed inside, locking the door behind me and throwing the deadbolt with shaking hands. I don't know what followed me that night. I don't know who or what was leaving footprints in the snow behind me, or why it spoke to me. But I do know one thing. I'll never walk alone in the snow again. Not at night. Not if I can help it. The voice is still with me. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, or when the world is perfectly still, I hear it, a whisper in the dark. I'm still here, and I know that voice. I'll never forget it. It's the voice of something that's waiting. Story number 4. The mysterious death in the abandoned house. You could say I've never been one to shy away from a little adventure, though I'm not exactly proud of some of the decisions I've made in the past. That night was one of those decisions. It was the dead of winter, the kind of cold that bites into your bones and refuses to let go, the kind of cold that makes you question your sanity when you step outside. But there I was, bundled in a coat that wasn't quite thick enough, walking along with 4 of my closest friends, Matt, Sarah, Jack, and Katie, as we approached the old house at the end of South Street. The house had always intrigued me. It had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, but there was always something about it that felt off. It wasn't just that it had been left to rot, though that was certainly part of it. The shutters hung crookedly, the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect, and the windows, which had once been clear and bright, were now covered in grime and cobwebs. There was something in the air around the house, something that made you look over your shoulder every time you passed by, as if you weren't alone. That night, we were going to see it up close. "You sure about this?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with skepticism, as we stood at the foot of the cracked stone steps. He was always the cautious one, the one who thought things through before acting. It made him a good friend, but it also made him a little too safe for my tastes. Matt and Sarah, on the other hand, were already laughing, completely unconcerned. "Oh, come on, man," Matt said, slapping Jack on the back. "What's the worst that could happen? It's just an old house. There's nothing spooky about it." But we all knew that wasn't true. There was something wrong about that house, something we couldn't explain, and that was why we were here in the first place. I pushed open the creaking gate, the sound like a scream in the cold night air, and led the way up the steps. We didn't bother knocking or trying the door. Everyone knew it was locked. We came prepared. Jack had brought a crowbar, just in case. We forced the door open with a groan, the hinges protesting, and stepped into the dark hallway. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew hit us immediately. It was like the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to come and disturb its silence. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah muttered, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. I noticed her eyes darting to the corners of the room, as if she expected something or someone to jump out at her. "Relax," Katie said with a nervous laugh. "We're just here to explore. No ghosts, no monsters, just a bunch of old furniture and maybe a few rats." But even as she spoke, we all knew she didn't believe that. None of us did. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of our flashlights. We moved through the ground floor, exploring the rooms one by one. There was nothing too remarkable, just old furniture covered in sheets, peeling wallpaper, and broken windows that let in the cold night air. But the deeper we went into the house, the more I felt that unease creeping up my spine, the kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched, even though you can't see anyone. When we reached the staircase, I hesitated, Are we really going up there? I asked, my voice a little shakier than I wanted it to be. Matt grinned at me. Come on, don't be such a baby. We've made it this far, right? I nodded, but I didn't feel brave. The stairs creaked under our weight, the sound echoing through the empty house. At the top of the stairs was a narrow hallway, and at the end of it, a door that had been locked, but now, as we approached, was slightly ajar. Isn't this the room they always talk about? Katie asked, her voice low. The one where they say people disappeared? Matt pushed the door open with a groan, and we all stepped inside. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the house. It was also darker, the only light coming from the flickering flashlights we held in our hands. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center of the floor. It looked like an ordinary wooden chair, but there was something wrong about it. It was old, warped by years of neglect, and the floor around it was stained with dark, sticky patches that had been there for longer than I cared to think about. But it wasn't the chair that caught our attention. It was the body. At first, I didn't believe what I was seeing. I thought it was a mannequin, some kind of sick joke left behind by someone else who had dared to enter the house. But when I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat, I saw the truth. The body was human. It was the body of a man, sitting perfectly upright in the chair, his back straight as though he had been placed there deliberately. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, unblinking. His face was a grotesque mask of decay, the skin stretched tight over the bones, the flesh rotting away in places, leaving only yellowed bone and blackened patches where the tissue had melted away. His hands were resting in his lap, fingers stiff and curled as if frozen in place. The worst part wasn't the state of his body, though. It was the expression on his face, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth open in a silent scream, as if he had died in the middle of a terrible realization. The air in the room grew even colder as we stood there, staring at him in disbelief. Jesus Christ, Matt whispered, his voice shaking. What happened to him? None of us could answer. We didn't know. We spent what felt like hours in that room, trying to make sense of it. We called the police, but when they arrived, they didn't find the body. They found the room, sure, but no sign of the man who had been sitting there. No body, no blood, nothing. They searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no trace of what we had seen. The police chalked it up to our imagination, maybe a prank from someone else. But I knew what I had seen, and I could feel the cold presence of that man watching us long after we left the house. The house, too, seemed to have vanished into the night, as though it had never been there at all. The next morning, when we went back to find it, the house was empty, no longer standing, no longer real. The place where it had been was just a patch of grass, a few scattered leaves. We never spoke of it again, not to each other and not to anyone else. But I can still feel that chill in the air, that feeling of being watched. And I know deep down that whatever was in that house is still out there, waiting for someone else to come and find it. And if you ever find yourself walking down a quiet street, on a cold winter night, don't stop to look at the houses you pass. Some doors are better left unopened. Story number 5. The driverless cars. I'm not the kind of person who believes in coincidences. Life, in my experience, has a way of following its own pattern, logical, predictable. The strange thing is, sometimes life has a way of twisting those patterns until they don't make sense anymore. That's what happened to me one cold, lonely night in December. A night I'll never forget. A night that changed how I see the world, or maybe how I see what's beyond it. It had been a long day, a lot of stress at work, a few too many beers at the bar, and the kind of night that I thought would be better spent in my own bed. I lived on the outskirts of town, just far enough away that I could get some peace and quiet, but close enough to downtown that I could be at the office in 15 minutes if I had to. On this particular night, I was walking home from the bar, cutting through one of the quieter, older neighborhoods in the city. It was nearly midnight, and the streets were empty, save for the occasional shadow of a passing car or the fluttering of a newspaper being blown along by the wind. The snow had begun to fall softly, a thick blanket covering the sidewalks. There was something about it that made the night feel heavier than usual. The air was cold, but not unbearable. My boots left prints in the fresh snow as I walked, the only sound in the quiet street. That's when I saw them. First, I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. A line of cars, all parked along the side of the street, neatly aligned as though someone had parked them there on purpose. But there was something off about it. The street was dead. No other cars were on the road. No people walking by. Just these vehicles, parked as still as statues in the falling snow. I moved closer. They were the kind of cars you'd expect to see in a small town, nothing fancy. Just regular sedans, minivans, and even an old pickup truck or two. The kind of vehicles that people use for commuting, for errands, for getting on with their lives. But when I reached the first one, I froze. Every single one of them had the same thing in common. No one was inside. I peered through the fogged-up windows. The seats were empty. The steering wheels were untouched. The doors were all locked. Windows up. Not a single sign of life. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Not because of the cold, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the owners had just stepped out. Maybe they'd been forced to leave in a hurry. But the longer I stood there, the more the feeling of unease grew. I looked up and down the street. Still no movement. No sign of anyone. I decided to leave. My feet carried me down the sidewalk. But the hairs on the back of my neck stayed standing. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. The streetlights overhead flickered once, then steadied, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was following me. I turned the corner, my eyes darting nervously over my shoulder. I didn't see anything, just the snow falling, the street lit by the cold, harsh glow of the street lamps. But then I heard it, a faint sound, like a soft shuffle, the scrape of shoes against snow. I stopped dead in my tracks. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. No one was there. The street was as empty as it had been since I'd first stepped into it. But that feeling, it wouldn't go away. I could feel something or someone near me, watching me, closing in. I took another step, and then another. But just as I started walking again, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A shape, a figure, a shadow. It was there, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. A dark, shifting shape, like a man, but distorted, stretched out. It moved with a strange, jerky motion, like it wasn't quite solid, like it didn't belong. I froze again, every part of me screaming to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I turned my head slowly, trying to track the shadow's movements. But when I looked back, it was gone. Nothing. Just the empty street, the snow, the eerie stillness. I walked faster now, my pulse quickening. But the dread was still there, crawling up my spine. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder to take. I could almost hear my heart pounding in my ears. Then I heard it again, the scrape of feet on the snow, like someone was walking just behind me. I spun around, and I saw nothing. But I knew with every fiber of my being, that something was there, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the snow-covered pavement. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care if I looked like a fool. I needed to get out of there. My lungs burned from the cold air, but I couldn't stop. The shadow was still with me, just out of sight but always present, like a dark stain on my peripheral vision. I ran until I reached my apartment building, slamming the door behind me as I hurried inside. I leaned against the door, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I finally convinced myself it had been my imagination. Too much beer, too little sleep, the cold playing tricks on my mind. I convinced myself that I was safe. But when I went to bed that night, I left the blinds open, just a little, just enough to see the street below. I needed to know. It's been 3 days since that night. The street outside my apartment is quiet. As usual, I haven't seen those cars again. Haven't seen the shadow. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside and the city is still, I feel it. The eyes. The ones that follow me when I walk down the street. The ones that linger in the dark. I know what I saw, and I know I'm not alone. Story number 6. The Ghost on the Snowy Road. I've never been one to believe in ghosts. I've always thought of myself as a practical man. The type who believes in what he can see, hear, touch, and measure. But that night, on the side of that snow-covered road, I saw something that I can't explain. I still don't have the words for it. Not the right ones anyway, but I'll try, for what it's worth. Maybe it's time to tell the story. It was late November. Rachel and I had decided to take a long drive up to the mountains. Something to clear our heads after a hectic few months. We had rented a cabin near a small, isolated town for a weekend getaway. The kind of place where there was nothing to do except read books, drink wine, and maybe take a walk in the woods. We were looking forward to the quiet, the isolation, just the two of us. The snow had started falling heavily as we drove through the winding mountain roads. The tires of the car crunched in the thickening snow, and the world outside the windshield became a blur of white. The radio had stopped working about an hour ago, and we didn't see any other cars on the road. The night was dark, colder than we expected, and the silence inside the car was the kind that presses against you, making your thoughts feel heavy. Rachel was dozing off beside me, her head resting against the window, her breathing steady. I kept my eyes on the road, my fingers gripping the wheel a little tighter with each mile. The headlights barely pierced the storm, and I had to slow down to avoid losing control on the slick road. The further we went, the quieter the world seemed, the more isolated we became. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered and died. I cursed under my breath and tried to restart the car. Nothing. The dashboard flickered for a second, but the engine didn't turn over. We were stuck, in the middle of nowhere. Great, Rachel muttered, waking up with a start. What now? I checked the gas gauge. It was full. The battery wasn't dead either. So, of course, I did what any man would do in that situation. I popped the hood and went out into the freezing cold to see what had happened. The snow had started to fall heavier, thick flakes swirling in the air, covering the ground in a matter of minutes. I couldn't see much under the hood, nothing obvious. Nothing that would explain the sudden failure. I closed it and leaned against the car, trying to gather my thoughts. That's when I saw her. A figure stood just off the side of the road, barely visible through the falling snow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a lost hiker. But then I realized she wasn't moving, just standing there, in the middle of nowhere. She was dressed in white, a long, flowing white coat that almost seemed to glow in the dark. Her face was obscured by the snow, but I could tell she was looking right at me. "Rachel," I said, my voice shaking more than I intended. "There's someone out there." Rachel, still sitting in the car, looked at me confused. "What? Who is it?" I didn't answer right away. The woman wasn't moving, just standing there as the snow piled around her. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I don't know why, but something about her, about the way she stood so still, so unnatural, sent a shiver straight to my bones. "Stay here," I said to Rachel, though my voice trembled. I started walking toward the figure, my boots crunching in the snow. The wind picked up, and the snow came down in sheets, blurring everything around me. The woman didn't budge. She didn't even seem to notice me. When I was about 10 feet away, I called out to her. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" There was no answer, just the quiet howl of the wind. I took another step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when she moved slowly, almost imperceptibly. turning her head toward me. I froze. Her face, pale, gaunt, was now visible beneath the hood of her coat. Her features sharp and unnatural, like they had been frozen in time. Her eyes, black, empty, were fixed on me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, just the wind, whispering through the trees. I could feel my pulse racing, my breath shallow, and then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone, vanished, disappeared into the snow as if she had never been there. I stood there, my body numb with shock, staring at the spot where she had been. The snow had already started to fill in the space where she had stood. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign she had ever been there at all. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But eventually, I turned back to the car. Rachel was staring out the window, her face pale. "You saw her too, didn't you?" I asked, though I was sure of the answer. Rachel nodded, her eyes wide. She just disappeared. Where did she go? "I don't know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But we need to get out of here. Now." I jumped into the car and tried to start the engine again. This time, the engine roared to life, the headlights flickering to life. The radio crackled for a moment, then went silent again. I didn't care. All I cared about was getting out of there. We drove for what felt like hours, not speaking, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, we made it to a small town, and I pulled into the first gas station I saw. I went inside, hoping to find some answers. The old man behind the counter looked at me like he had seen a ghost. "You folks all right?" he asked, eyeing me up and down. I could see that he recognized the look in my eyes. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just had a weird experience." The man didn't say anything at first. Then, after a long pause, he spoke in a low voice. "You ain't the first. Not by a long shot." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "There's a woman out there, in the snow. She's been spotted for years. They say she's the ghost of a woman who went missing a long time ago, somewhere along that road. Never found her body, but they say she wanders the snow every winter, waiting for someone to help her." I felt the blood drain from my face. "And what happened to her?" The man's eyes darkened, his voice low. "No one knows. Some say she was murdered. Some say she just vanished. But every year, someone sees her. And every year, someone disappears." Rachel and I never went back that way again. I don't know if the woman in the snow was a ghost, or if she was something else entirely, something darker. But I know what I saw that night, and no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget those empty black eyes staring back at me through the storm. And every winter, when the snow starts to fall, I can't help but wonder if she's still out there, waiting. Story number 7. The stranger outside the window. It was a bitterly cold night in early December, when the snow fell thick and heavy, covering the world in a blanket of white. Dunsford, a quiet little town in northern Maine, was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. Most people didn't even lock their doors. Crime was unheard of, and on nights like this, it was as if time itself slowed down, and everyone tucked in, feeling safe and warm from the howling winds outside. We, my wife Rachel, our 2 kids Emma and Josh, and I had settled into a quiet evening by the fire. Rachel had prepared a pot of hot tea, the steam rising from the mugs, curling in the cold air of the living room. The flickering light of the fire painted the walls in dancing shadows, the crackling of the logs filling the space. It was the sort of night that felt like a calm before the storm, though we didn't know it at the time. "Do you hear that?" Rachel's voice broke through the silence. She had put down her book, her brow furrowed. I glanced over at her. "What do you mean?" She cocked her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "There's something outside." I stood up, stretching the stiffness out of my back. I walked over to the window and peered through the curtains. The snow was falling fast, the streetlights glowing through the storm. Everything was silent. No one was out there. Nothing seemed out of place. I don't hear anything, I said, more to reassure her than to make a point. But then, as I was turning back to her, came again a knock, soft at first, then louder, a rhythmic tap that echoed through the quiet house. 3 knocks, not from the door, but from the window, outside. My heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly, but Rachel was already on her feet, her face pale. "Who is it?" she whispered, her voice tight. I walked over to the front door, heart racing now. There was something about the sound that didn't sit right. It wasn't the sound of a person's knock. It was too deliberate, too calculated. I opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking in the stillness. Outside, the snowstorm raged, but no one was there. No one, I muttered to myself, stepping out onto the porch. The world was blanketed in white. The only sound was the whispering wind. I looked around, no tracks in the snow, just pure, untouched whiteness stretching into the dark. The only signs of life, the dark silhouettes of trees shaking under the weight of the snow. I stood there for a moment, listening, but nothing. No voices, no movement. It was as if the world had swallowed whoever had been knocking. I closed the door and turned to Rachel. Her eyes were wide with fear. "What is it, Jake?" I didn't know how to answer. "Maybe it's just kids, pranking us," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. Rachel didn't seem reassured. She glanced nervously at the windows, the curtains now drawn tight. "Just a prank," I repeated. "Let's get back to the fire." But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The air felt heavy. The house seemed too quiet. I tried to shake it off, but that nagging feeling didn't go away. We sat back down in front of the fire, the crackling of the logs a small comfort in the tense silence that had settled over us. The kids were still on the rug, playing with their toys, unaware of the unease that had gripped the rest of us. The next few nights, the knocks returned the next night. At first, it was just once, a soft tap, like a knuckle against glass. But as the hours passed, the knocks grew louder and more persistent. 3 knocks at first, then 5, then 10. Each night, the knocking continued, each time from a different window, always at the same time just after midnight. As the storm outside reached its peak, I called the police, of course, but by the time they arrived, there was no trace of anyone, no footprints in the snow, no sign of a car parked outside, no explanation. It was as if whoever or whatever was knocking had never been there at all. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the wind, or perhaps kids playing pranks in the neighborhood. But Rachel was convinced that something wasn't right. She could feel it too, the presence that seemed to hover just outside the window, watching. We took to locking the windows at night, pulling the curtains shut as tightly as possible. But the knocking didn't stop. The final night, it was the 4th night that I realized we weren't dealing with something human. Something had been trying to reach us, and it wasn't going to stop. I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of the knocks again. 3 sharp, deliberate taps on the living room window. I could hear Rachel's breathing beside me, shallow and anxious. Emma and Josh were sound asleep, completely unaware of the growing terror that had begun to suffocate us. I got out of bed slowly, moving toward the window. This time, couldn't ignore it. The knocking was coming from outside, but there was no one there. I opened the curtain just enough to look out into the snowstorm. The yard was still, the trees shaking in the wind. The darkness felt alive, like it was waiting for something. And then I saw it, a figure, just standing there, in the middle of the yard, facing the house. The silhouette was tall and thin, too tall to be human. It didn't move, didn't shift its weight, didn't even blink, just stood there, staring into the window, its face obscured by the darkness of the storm. I froze, and then, as if it had been waiting for me to notice, it moved, slowly, deliberately. It raised one hand to the window, not to knock, but to press its fingers against the glass. The fingers were impossibly long, too long, like something you'd see in a nightmare. Its touch left a streak of frost on the window, as if it was cold enough to freeze the glass itself. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, but before I could react, the figure was gone, vanished into the snow, like it had never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. Rachel and I spent the rest of the night watching the windows, clutching each other, too afraid to speak. The kids slept soundly, oblivious to the horror that had been outside our door. The next morning, the storm cleared, the snow stopped falling, and the sky was a pale blue. We looked outside, but there were no signs of anything unusual. No footprints in the snow, no strange figures, just the quiet stillness of a world that had returned to normal. But we knew it wasn't over. Whatever had been out there was still watching, still waiting. I've moved away from Dunsford now. My family and I are somewhere new, far from that cursed town. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the wind howls just right and the snow falls thick, I hear the knocks again. They come at my window, gentle at first, then louder, more insistent, and I know that whatever it was is still out there, waiting, and I can't escape it.